Some kind of expectation. Press conference is in this room all the time.
What happened to the screen? The screen just got through. Goes through. Yeah.
Good afternoon. I want to start by saying a few things, the most important of which is an apology to the Clark family. There is no question that the loss of life, no matter what the circumstances are, is always somber and very serious. There is no question that the death of Stephon Clark was a tragedy, not just for his family, but for this community. I can certainly understand that there is tremendous grief, anger, and anxiety by the Clark family and by this community. I did have an opportunity this morning to meet with Mr. Clark's mother. That grief was very apparent. My job as the district attorney is to make sure that we conduct a full, fair, and independent review of the shooting. That job means that I follow the facts and the law, and that in that process of this review, that we treat everyone with dignity, grace, and fairness. Today, we will be presenting our findings of this review. I want to talk for a few minutes about the role of the district attorney's office before we go into the facts and the law. And before I start the role in this particular slide, I want everyone to be reminded that this is a death investigation. It is a death investigation. And as with the loss of any life, the details of that investigation can be very graphic, clearly very tragic. Graphic because a human being died. But even more graphic because we live in a world today, a world of technology, where those graphic details are captured on camera or on video, and ultimately the whole world can see. In this particular case, the investigation and the review included evidence of body-worn camera from the Sacramento Police Department, as well as video from the sheriff's helicopter that captured this event. The reality is, as prosecutors, we deal with graphic evidence every day. Every single day in that building across the street. We hear it, we see the real-life consequences of what happens in these types of cases. But the fact that we see that every day in our profession does not take away from the reality that we are viewing the loss of somebody's life. I want to warn everybody that what we're going to hear and see is in fact very graphic. The fact that we as prosecutors do this every day in our profession does not mean that we do not have compassion. Our responsibility has and always will be that we look at the facts in what we call a dispassionate manner, meaning that our responsibility is to look at those facts objectively. But the fact that we look at something in a dispassionate manner does not mean that we lack compassion. And so when I talk about today, I want everybody to understand very clearly, because of this evidence, that we have done our very best to balance transparency with sensitivity to the Clark family, sensitivity to this community. We have done our very best to balance accuracy with compassion. When we talk about the role of the District Attorney's Office, our question in this review is limited to one question. Was a crime committed? It is a question that we answer every day in our profession as prosecutors. It's a question that's posed to every District Attorney's Office across this state and across this country. Was a crime committed? That question demands the same evaluation that we do in all criminal cases. And here in Sacramento alone, we answer that question somewhere between 35 to 40,000 times a year. Was a crime committed? As prosecutors, and when I became a prosecutor almost 30 years ago, we all take the same oath. And that oath is to follow the law and the facts in making a decision. And I want to remind everyone, whether it's the media, whether it's the community, what those responsibilities are. And there's a jury instruction that's given in every criminal case in California. Every single criminal case, no matter what the charge, the jury, who would be the trier of fact, is told in every case, you must only decide the facts based upon the evidence presented. You must follow the law, whether you agree with that law or not. And you must not make a decision that is based upon bias or public opinion. And perhaps most importantly, in every criminal case, every day that jury is reminded that you must not decide the case until all of the facts are presented. Again, the single question we have today in our review was a crime committed? Now, I want to explain a few things which many people understand, but perhaps not everybody understands. And that is what our review does not address. Our review does not address if there is civil responsibility or civil liability on behalf of the officers or the police department in this case. Our review does not address any police policy and whether that policy may or may not have been violated. And our review does not address whether or not there were other police tactics that could have been used in this particular case. It is important that everybody understand that I acknowledge that these are very valid conversations to be had. They are valid questions for people to have. And they are conversations that I look forward to being part of. But that is not the question of today. These are not the topic of today. The topic of today is that one question. I want to go over what materials were received for our review. And before I do that, I want to just mention who in the DA's office was involved in this review. Myself, our chief deputy, our assistant district attorney, our head of homicide, and our head of special investigations. Combined, we have nearly 150 years of prosecutorial experience. Every one of us has been assigned to the homicide unit and handled homicide. Every one of us has extensive trial experience and tried many cases in the courtroom across the street. I say that because I want everyone to understand that we dedicated tremendous resources for the right reasons in this case. In terms of the timeline of these reports being received, I want to just mention that because I know that many people have been anxious and anticipating this and have questioned why is it taking so long. As many of you may know, our policy is to do our very best to issue our report and findings within 90 days of actually completing our review, 90 days of the investigation being complete. So in this case, the Sacramento Police Department delivered their report at the end of October. We then received the investigation reports from the Department of Justice in the middle of January. And then we received the independent experts report at the beginning of February. Again, we are within our policy, and we've done our very best to expedite this, but at the same time to balance that with a full, fair, independent review. So what was received? As you can see over here on the monitor, we received the Sacramento Police Department's full case file. We received the California Department of Justice report as well. We received 911 recordings. We received dispatch recordings and logs. We received a significant amount of body-worn camera, helicopter, in-car camera, surveillance, and crime scene recordings. Significant amount of that evidence. We also received photographs and diagrams. And we also received both audio and video recordings of witnesses that were interviewed through the course of this investigation. In addition to that, we also received crime lab reports from our crime lab. We received what we call a Cellbrite extraction report, which in essence is a phone analysis done on Mr. Clark's phone. We received the report of the outside expert, David Blake, Sacramento County Coroner's report, a report from a review of that coroner's report by Dr. Greg Reiber, and we also received a report from the San Diego Medical Examiner's Department that was acquired by the Department of Justice. Now I want to go into what I would call the initial response, the initial police response. And to understand why am I starting here, in every case that we look at, our review, we want to know how did this all start. And so I'm going to walk everybody through this. We're going to talk about what happened and what the facts are in this case. At a little after 9 on Sunday, March 18th, a citizen called 911 to report that a person was walking down 29th Street breaking car windows. What we now know from the investigation and through that initial contact with police is that the clothing description of that person was consistent with Stephon Clark, what he was wearing. We also know through this investigation that DNA analysis and other physical evidence shows that that person who was walking down 29th Street was in fact Stephon Clark. At the time, it wasn't known. The police officers never knew who the person was. But I am going to refer to that person as Mr. Clark because we now know that that was him. When the police arrived, what the law enforcement discovered was that that citizen who had called 911 had confronted Mr. Clark with a baseball bat because he was breaking into car windows. That witness described that the suspect, Mr. Clark, was last seen jumping a fence into a backyard. Sacramento police officers Mercadal and Robinette were the officers that were dispatched to this call. We also know that at the time of this incident, the Sacramento Sheriff's Department helicopter was in the area and they offered to assist. I want to emphasize this again, and I'm sure I will say it again, is that none of the officers knew Mr. Clark was a suspect, nor did they know that his grandparents lived on 29th Street. I want to give an overall sense of this scene. Oh, I'm sorry, let me back up a little bit. When the officers arrived there, spoke to that 911 caller, they then saw those broken car windows, and then they began doing what we would call a neighborhood search and searching that nearby yard. I want to give a sense of the overall scene. I'm going to try to do this the best I can. Some of this will come up later through some of the helicopter videos and photographs, but this is on the right here is a photograph capture from the helicopter. And to orient people as to what we're talking about here is this is the house of Mr. Clark's grandparents. 7572 is obviously, we all know, the scene of the shooting. In front of the house is a Camry, and over here to the right side are two Ford Explorers. The 911 caller was the owner of these two Ford Explorers. You're going to hear evidence later about a rear sliding glass door that was broken. That is the house next door, which is 7570. You're going to hear about a house that the officers went to initially to check and see if they could find the suspect. That's up here at 7566. So that's simply to orient everybody to what we're talking about. When the officers arrived, and I said that they noticed the car damage. Down here on the bottom is that Toyota Camry that sat almost outside the front area of the grandparents' house. You will notice here on the bottom of this photograph that there is a grate, a security grate. That becomes important for later because the evidence of this investigation shows that that security grate came from the home of the grandparents outside their home. Up here, you can see the two Ford Explorers. These belong, as I said, to the 911 caller, and that was photographs taken obviously after this. It is important to mention that after the investigation, it was discovered that there was no evidence that anything was stolen or taken from any of these cars. I'm going to next show you some of the body-worn camera footage and the neighborhood search. And before I show that to you, it's important that people understand why are we showing this to you? Why does this matter? I would remind you that that 911 caller told those officers that the person that broke the windows was last seen jumping a fence into a nearby yard. This is the home of that yard, as I mentioned, 7566. This video will show the interaction of the officers with the homeowner of that house. It'll also then, the next video will show their searching of that backyard. And the reason for this video is to give people an opportunity to see the dynamics of the officers at that point. Because shortly, in a few minutes, we're going to show you the body-worn camera of the actual interaction with Mr. Clark. And it's important that people understand that the dynamics change. The dynamics change. It's going to take a couple seconds, but bear with us. Okay, so the next one is the same body-worn camera footage. It just is that when they get to the backyard to search her backyard. And what this next capture reveals is that they're searching that backyard. They're looking for a suspect. They're trying to make sure that that yard is secure. So as that video, that piece finishes, at that moment when they finished up the search of that backyard, the officers were then receiving additional information that the sheriff's helicopter had observed somebody in yet another backyard. And those officers were then instructing the Sacramento police officers of what was going on. And I want to talk about the observations from the helicopter. And as I mentioned, the sheriff's department had that helicopter in the air. There was a deputy that was considered to be what they call the observer. And what that deputy observed was that Mr. Clark, who he did not know at the time, but the suspect, was seen in another backyard, and he was staring into a rear sliding glass door. This is all occurring while the helicopter is overhead. Later, through the investigation, it was discovered that in that home lived an 89-year-old man who was watching television when that rear slider was smashed. Mr. Clark was seen smashing the rear sliding glass, and the Sacramento police officers were advised by this deputy of what he saw. At that moment, the helicopter video was activated. I want to show you now a photograph that was taken after this incident of the damage to that backyard. And it may be a little difficult to tell, but what this shows is that the entirety of that back door was smashed. It's a little bit difficult to tell, but there is cardboard and some wood that was put there after this incident to kind of protect the glass. But the entirety of that back door was shattered. Now, I'm going to go into the helicopter video in a couple of seconds here, but before I start that, I want to, the reality is that many of us have watched this many, many times, so we know what we're seeing, but I want to orient people as to what you're going to see. The video starts with Mr. Clark running from that sliding glass door. He then runs and he jumps on, I think it's a trailer, jumps up and jumps over a fence. When he jumps over that fence, you cannot see, there's no indication that he's holding anything in his hand. He jumps over that fence, he goes through a side gate, and he starts to walk up along the side of the house, which we now know was his grandparents' house. When you watch that video, you will notice that as he walks alongside that house, there's a similar, identical security grate as the one that was found by the Toyota Camry. As he goes up alongside that house, he stops by a car. He's standing there. There's no indication that he has anything in his hands at that time. And he's staring into the side of the car. You will also hear the sheriff's helicopter deputies say that the only thing that he can tell about the suspect is that he's wearing a hoodie. Now, before I show the video, I want to orient everybody. This is obviously daylight photos of the back of that yard. Over here on the left, I'm going to start and move from left to right. This photograph here is the back of the house, and the far left portion is where the officers come around, and you will see, ultimately, they take cover behind the corner of that house. The middle photograph here is important because there's a picnic bench, and immediately to the right of that picnic bench is a chair. Over here on the left is another photograph that shows you the right-hand side of that house as you're looking at it, and as you can see, there is an open pathway back out to the front of that house. I would remind everybody that this video footage can be graphic. I want to go back now to an overall view of the scene so people can again understand what we're talking about. We know that the shooting happened here at 7572. This is where the Camry was located, with the grate sitting outside that Camry. What we know from witness statements is that the Camry was the first car window that was smashed. He then went over and smashed the two Ford Explorers. He then was seen by this 911 caller jumping a fence up to 7562. And then when the helicopter observed him, he was in the backyard over here at 7570, the next door house of where the shooting occurred. And from there, you can see he comes and jumps over that fence as shown in the video. So what do we know at this point in terms of the facts at this point? We know that a citizen called 911 for help. We know that Mr. Clark smashed 3 car windows, that he jumped fences into backyards, that he smashed the rear slider of that home while the helicopter was overhead. We know also that after doing that, he jumped another fence and continued to flee into another yard. That yard, we obviously now know, was his grandparents'. That was not known at the time. We also know that when he jumped that fence and he went through that side gate, he then went up to that car and was looking into the car. The officers were directed to the side of that house by the helicopter where Mr. Clark was seen. We know that the officers approached Mr. Clark and that lead officer had his gun drawn. And we know at that point that Mr. Clark fled into the backyard and the officers pursued him. And we know from that video that that's when the shooting occurred. I'm going to play the body-worn camera now of Officer Mercadal. And before I do that, I want to make a few comments. First of all, I am not an expert on body-worn camera, but there are some things I do understand. It is just that. It is a camera. It is restricted by the lens. If I were to be standing here in front of you with a body-worn camera, and I have that on front of me, it may only show a few of you here, but that doesn't mean that you're not all here. You are restricted by that lens. If we were standing here in the dark and I had that camera on, it may not capture everything. My eyes may see something that it does not capture. It may capture things that the officers did not see. But those are all things that are considered in the evaluation of this evidence. Again, I want to remind everybody that this is graphic, and this is troubling to watch.
Over here, Jerry. Jerry. Hey! Come here! Come on! Come on! Watch this stuff. Come here! Come here! Come here! Watch that stuff, watch that stuff right now. Show me your hands! See your hands! Watch that knee down. No movement. We're going to use this unit. Come in from the left start. Let's see your hands! You all right? Good? Still pointing. Yeah, I'm all right. I think I'm good. Step by on that. He's still down, he's not moving. You can't do that.
So what do we see from that body-worn camera? We see that Officer Mercadal yelled to Mr. Clark, "Hey, show me your hands, stop, stop." We know that Mr. Clark ran to the backyard and around that corner of the house into the backyard. We know that it was dark out, and we know the officers pursued him into that backyard. We know that as they rounded the corner, to that corner of the house, that at that moment, Mr. Clark was approximately 30 feet away from them, standing behind a picnic table and really even standing farther behind that chair. In separate interviews after the shooting, both officers were interviewed and they described what they saw. Both described that Mr. Clark was facing them with his arms extended in a shooting stance. Both officers described that. Both officers believed that he was pointing a gun at them. Officer Mercadal, in his statement, said that he saw a flash of light that he believed was a muzzle flash from a gun. Officer Robinette, in his statement, believed that the flash of light was reflecting off of a metallic object, a gun. That body-worn camera video that I showed captures 30 frames per second. 30 frames. I'm going to show you some of the frames, two of which that occurred within a 1 second period of time. On the left here is one of the captures of the frames from Officer Mercadal's body-worn camera. And over here, you can see Mr. Clark is at that picnic table facing the officers. He's behind the picnic table, he's behind that chair, and he's facing the officers. In that same second, the body-worn capture frame captured this flash of light at the same time that he was facing the officers. We know, in terms of the factual summary, that Officer Mercadal, when he rounded that corner of the house, that he yelled, "Show me your hand, gun." We know, by listening to this body-worn camera many times, and many times with headphones, that Mr. Clark yelled back at the officers. We know that both officers immediately took cover. That's clear on the helicopter video. It's clear on the body-worn camera. And in fact, on the helicopter, you can actually see one of them pulling the other officer back for cover. We know that the officers then peered around that corner again, and that Mr. Clark had, in fact, advanced on those officers. He had advanced on the officers. We know the second time that Officer Mercadal peered around that corner, he yelled, "Show me your hands, gun, gun, gun." And we know that the helicopter video conclusively shows that Mr. Clark was, in fact, advancing on the officers. I'm going to show you now a slowed-down clip of that helicopter video showing just that. You can see, to start, they're down behind the corner of the house. I'm going to play that one more time. This is a screen capture of that video, which you can see the red arrows pointing to Mr. Clark. He has now advanced along the side of that house in front of that picnic table towards those officers. After this shooting, obviously there was crime scene examination done. Again, back to the far left photo, we now have the distances. So we know from the point that the officers were at the corner of that house to the point where Mr. Clark's body ultimately fell was approximately 15 feet. the distance from that location, I'm sorry, it was 16 feet, but the distance from the location from where he fell to behind that couch or chair was 15 feet. The total amount was approximately 30 feet distance initially, and he advanced 15 feet. Now, I want to go over what does the body-worn camera show immediately after the shooting. And I'll explain in a minute why this is relevant for our review. The first thing that I want to talk about is the demeanor of the officers immediately after that shooting. As you can recall, we showed you the neighborhood video of the officers interacting with the female lady that had the dog and the interaction there. And as I mentioned, you would be able to tell from this body-worn camera that the dynamics changed. Some may ask, why does it matter? Why do we consider the demeanor of the officers? Because what you can hear on that body-worn camera, they're breathing heavy. You can tell there's stress in their voices. And you can tell that the situation has become very tense and rapidly moving. These are all things that we must consider in our analysis. And what you can see clearly from the contrasting of the initial neighborhood search is that the dynamics change at that moment of time. There are also several statements made by the officers that are captured on that body-worn camera immediately after the shooting. In our world, as prosecutors, we call those spontaneous statements. And the reason they are called that is because there's an area of the law of evidence that says that we can use, or anybody can use, spontaneous statements to prove or disprove a certain fact. Spontaneous statements are, if you look at them from a common sense point of view, the point is that if you are under a stressful event and you make some kind of spontaneous statement under the excitement of that event, it is considered inherently reliable, it's considered trustworthy, and primarily it's considered trustworthy because the individuals do not have an opportunity to reflect on what is going on. These statements become highly relevant for our analysis. So what did those officers say on that body-worn camera as shown that we just showed you? Show me your hands. Let's see your hands. Officer Mercadal, you all right? You hit? Officer Robinette, yeah, I'm good. He was still pointing when I saw him again. You all right? Officer Mercadal, yeah, I'm all right. I don't think I'm hit or anything. The body-worn camera also shows, and you will have an opportunity to look at all of this with the full report, but you can tell on that video that the officers ultimately discuss a safe approach to removing the gun. Clearly, we all know he didn't have a gun. But those officers at that moment in time clearly did believe that. They discussed the safe approach to removing the gun. I want to talk about the autopsy and toxicology in this case. It's important for people to understand that in every autopsy, there's essentially three components. There's what we call an external examination of the person, an internal examination, and a toxicology screening. The cause of death in this case was multiple gunshot wounds. We know from the coroner's report he was shot 7 times. There was also toxicology done in this case. And some people may wonder, why are we talking about the toxicology of the man that was shot? Well, for our review and for our analysis, we must consider this evidence for a couple reasons. Because if somebody has stuff in their system drugs, or alcohol, that may have an impact on how they act or what's going on in their mind. A jury would be entitled to that information. But in addition, the toxicology results in this case become relevant for our analysis when I talk to you about what were the contents of Mr. Clark's phone. In this case, Mr. Clark had alcohol, Xanax, codeine, hydrocodone, marijuana, and cocaine metabolite. Again, we say this because it's important for our analysis, and we must consider it. In addition, on this the autopsy results, the findings of the coroner's office were reviewed by 4 pathologists, including the chief forensic pathologist from the coroner's office here in Sacramento. And those findings were supported by 2 independent pathologists, Dr. Greg Reiber and the San Diego chief medical examiner, who was hired by the Department of Justice. In addition, our crime lab performed a significant amount of forensic evidence in this case, analysis. I'm going to summarize it, but the full report that you'll have available today will have all of the crime scene evidence as well as crime lab evidence, as well as many other things in that report. But in summary, DNA and glass analysis conducted by the crime lab links Mr. Clark to all 3 of the car break-ins. Glass analysis shows that Mr. Clark used a cinder block to break the rear sliding glass door. You can recall back to that photograph of that shattered glass door. There was a cinder block located next to it. Paint analysis was done on the security grate by the Camry and the security grate by the grandparents' home. And that paint analysis links those security grates to the grandparents' grate near their home. Now, I'm going to talk about the cell phone evidence in this case. And before I get into that, I want to make a few comments. First of all, this evidence, the cell phone evidence, was conducted by both the Department of Justice as well as the Sacramento Police Department. They did what they called phone downloads, and they provided that information to us to consider in our review. Some may wonder, what is the importance of the cell phone evidence? There's probably 2 things that would be the most significant for us to consider is, was Mr. Clark filming the officers when he was in the backyard and he confronted them? And then secondly, what was going on in Mr. Clark's life? Is there anything in the cell phone that would show us that may have an impact on this case that we would have to consider? And before I go into the actual cell phone evidence, I want everybody to be reminded, because I'm sure everybody in this room has a cell phone. Cell phones are deeply personal. They are, and they have become, windows to our minds. They become an extension of ourselves, and they tell us about some of our most deeply personal thoughts in our relationships with other human beings. In every death investigation here, law enforcement seeks to gather as much evidence to find an understanding of the circumstances. And in every death investigation, those investigators will seek out social media and cell phone evidence, because oftentimes that evidence plays a critical role in the circumstances of what happened. Some may wonder, especially today, why are we talking about this? Isn't this invasive? Isn't it disrespectful? But I will say this again. Our job, in truth, is to look at all the facts. If we're going to do our job correctly, we're going to consider all the facts, even the ones that are deeply personal and even the ones that may be intimate, and even the ones that may be uncomfortable for us to talk about. Cell phone evidence is like spontaneous statements. It can and is considered inherently reliable. So, to answer the first question, was Mr. Clark filming the officers during that encounter? The answer to that question is no, he was not. In the cell phone evidence, that examination of his phone included phone calls, text messages, an email draft that was in a note form in his cell phone, internet searches. The cell phone examination revealed that there was an incident that happened on March 16th, 2 days before this, a domestic violence incident that happened with the mother of his children. Her name is Selena. That weighed very heavily on his mind. Very heavily. So, I'm going to say this again, because this is very sensitive information. We have done our very best to strike the right balance between transparency and sensitivity, between transparency and accuracy, and to use our discretion to the best of our ability, but also understanding our responsibility to follow the facts. So what do we know about this March 16th incident? On Friday, March 16th, 2 days before this, Sacramento police officers responded to a 911 call a little bit before midnight regarding a possible domestic violence incident between Mr. Clark and Selena. Selena, the mother of his children, reported to police that Mr. Clark had assaulted her. The police took a report, they documented her injuries, and they took photographs of the scene. When the police arrived that night, Mr. Clark was not there. But after taking that report, the police noted that Mr. Clark was arrestable for this incident of domestic violence, as well as probation violations. At the time of this incident, Mr. Clark was on 3 grants of misdemeanor probation, 2 of which involved domestic violence involving Selena, and 1 of which was a felony probation case for robbery. When we understand this March 16th incident and you consider it with all the forensic cell phone evidence, you can see that there were many things weighing heavily on his mind. What we know from the cell phone evidence is that in the 12 hours after that March 16th incident, Mr. Clark tried to call Selena 76 times. 76 times. We know that Mr. Clark made calls and texts to his probation officer, but because it was a weekend, he was not able to connect. We also know from the cell phone analysis that Mr. Clark searched the Sacramento District Attorney's website regarding domestic violence. We also know that he searched the Sacramento Police Department's online reporting system. We also know from his phone that he drafted an email to law enforcement denying this March 16th incident and stating, quote, "I'm pretty scared I'm going to be put in jail." There was also many, many text messages that went back and forth between him and Selena. It is clear that they had a very tumultuous relationship. We have done our best, again, to exercise discretion on these text messages because, quite frankly, they are deeply personal, they are graphic, and they're not appropriate for this forum. These are just examples, and they have been blurred out, obviously, to protect the sensitivity of this. You can look at the full report and you can see them. There are many. But in a reading of all of those text messages back and forth, there is clearly a central theme to what is happening between the two of them. In those text messages, Selena says to him that he's going to be locked up for the rest of his life, that he will never be able to see his children again, that she has reported this domestic violence incident to the police, and that there is a warrant out for his arrest. And she's very clear in those text messages that she's going to testify against him. In those responses, Mr. Clark oftentimes denies that March 16 incident, and at other times, he's trying to salvage their relationship and his family, quite frankly. In between these text messages, this is all occurring on Saturday the 17th. So we have Friday the 16th is the domestic violence incident. Saturday, March 17th is when these text messages are going on between the two of them. In between these text messages, Mr. Clark starts to search the internet. And those internet searches involve suicide. He searches over 24 sites about how one can commit suicide. And the focus of those are primarily on how does one do it by drug ingestion. To give you two examples, just briefly, of sites that he searched specifically. One was, what is the quickest and easiest way to kill yourself? And Xanax and alcohol, a combination that can kill, or could kill. Clearly, all of this shows us that many things were weighing heavily on his mind. In the phone analysis, there were texts and phone calls showing that he was seeking drugs, in particular Xanax, and then, in fact, he had obtained them. The last text message that Mr. Clark had with Selena was on Saturday evening around 8 o'clock. He had sent her some text messages asking her if he wanted her to kill himself. She did not reply. He then sent a text message to her with a photograph of his hand holding 10 Xanax pills. And in that text message, he said, "Let's fix our family or I'm going to take all of these." The response from Selena was very negative, and that was the last conversation, text message that they had between the two of them. I want to now kind of shift a little bit and talk about what our responsibility. We talked about the facts that came out in this investigation that were delivered to us. I want to talk about the legal analysis. The first question that we have in this analysis, was there probable cause for the officers to stop and detain Mr. Clark? The answer to that question is yes. They had the authority, the lawful authority, to stop and detain him. That was based upon the information provided by the citizen. It was based upon the fact that there were multiple car windows broken, based upon the information from the helicopter that he had just smashed a residential home window and was now seen fleeing into a backyard of somebody else. Again, they had no idea whose yard he was jumping into. The fact that Mr. Clark fled does not change our legal analysis. It does not diminish their lawful authority to stop him. They had probable cause to stop and detain him. The next question, which is the central question in this case, has to do with the law that provides that a police officer or any other person is justified in using deadly force if the officer honestly and reasonably believes that he or another person is in imminent danger of death or great bodily injury from the actions of the person who was shot. This law has been in existence from what we call the common law, which means it came before our country even started. You can look at the guiding principles of our Constitution and the case law that's come down from it. This law is not just law in Sacramento or California. It is the same law across this country. The officers and the citizens have the same rights. This law applies to anyone equally. The question then is, using this law, the question is, was the use of force lawful? Was the use of force in this case lawful? And we as prosecutors are guided by the U.S. Supreme Court law that deals with what we call use of force. And that Supreme Court law provides us principles and guidelines that we must follow. The law requires that we decide or we judge the reasonableness of an officer's actions based upon the circumstances confronting them at that moment of time. We must judge it at that moment in time. We must recognize, and this comes right out of the case law, we must recognize that they are often forced to make split-second decisions. We must also recognize that they are under tense, uncertain, and rapidly evolving circumstances. And we must understand that we cannot do it with the benefit of 20/20 hindsight. We must address it at that moment in time that they were confronted. So I want to talk about this concept of honest and reasonable belief, because that is the crux of this whole case. Did the officers have an honest and reasonable belief that they needed to defend themselves? I'm going to first talk for just a few minutes about Mr. Clark's conduct when he interacted with them that night. And some may wonder, why does that matter? Why does it matter what he did? Because what he did has a bearing on the officers, whether it was honest, whether it was reasonable. And the jury would be entitled to this information. So what we know from the conduct of Mr. Clark is that we know he fled from the officers after being told to stop. We know that he continued into the backyard. And we know that when he continued into the backyard, he rounded that corner and he went to the end of that yard and he turned around. He didn't continue to flee. He turned around and he was in a shooting stance with his arms extended. We know that when the officers yelled, "Show me your hands," he did not stop. He continued to advance. We know that from the helicopter video. We know it because the officers said that's what he did. We know the second time around that corner, again, he was still advancing, same position, arms out on those officers. We must also look at the conduct of the officers both immediately before, during, and after that shooting. Because again, the question is, did they have an honest and reasonable belief that they needed to defend themselves? We know as they rounded that corner, Officer Mercadal yelled that, what I said, "Show me your hands, gun." We know that in fact, Officer Mercadal grabbed his partner to pull him back behind the corner of that house. We know that that spontaneous statement supports their belief. We know that Officer Mercadal yelled again. We know that the body-worn camera shows that flash of light, consistent with what the officers said. Mercadal said they thought it was a muzzle flash. Robinette said he believed it was light reflecting off a gun. And we know that both officers, as well as that helicopter video, shows that Mr. Clark was advancing on them as they peered around that corner. And then when we talk about what happened right immediately after, those statements that they said, those spontaneous statements became very critical for our review. "You okay? You hit. He was still pointing at me. I don't see the gun." All of those statements that those officers made within the seconds after the shooting support the belief that they honestly, without hesitation, believed he had a gun. So when we look at all of these facts and circumstances, we look at all of it, everything. We ask our question that we started out with again. And that question is, was a crime committed? There's no question that a human being died. But when we look at the facts and the law, and we follow our ethical responsibilities, the answer to that question is no. And as a result, we will not charge these officers with any criminal liability related to the shooting death and the use of force on Stephon Clark. Now, I think it's important for me to then beg the next question is what happens tomorrow? What about now? What happens tomorrow? I don't think there's any question that people will be very upset and very angry. But I want people to understand the fact that no criminal charges will be filed in this case does not diminish in any way the tragedy, the anger, the frustration that we've heard since the time of his death. We cannot ignore that. We cannot, as me as an elected official, me as a public safety leader, me as a human being, we cannot ignore that there is essentially a rage in our community. We have an obligation to hear their voices. We have heard them. And we have an obligation to stand together so that everyone has the same opportunity. And we do what I've often said, which is to narrow that opportunity gap. Again, it is our responsibility, not just as human beings, but people that work in this profession, that we do everything we can to make sure that every person's voice is heard and that we address the changes that need to be made. Thank you. And with that, we'll take some questions. Yes, sir.
Compare the findings of this case in the officer not charged with the guilty candidate with the broad daylight and subsequent and still officer not charged in that.
I'm not going to compare this case to any other case. I'm only here to talk about this case.
Can you explain that this is going to bring up restrictions online for suicide? Is it suggesting that suicide might not be good?
I'm not suggesting that. No, I'm not. But I think it's quite clear that Mr. Clark was in a state of despair, and he was impaired. And it's very sad because no human being should be in that position. But the truth is that a jury would be entitled to that information if we brought charges. And we have to consider that. So that's why I kept saying all along, this is very sensitive, and it's not comfortable, but it is relevant. Yes. There's a lot of Supreme Court law in this area. You can look at the whole report, one of which is the Graham versus Connor decision. So we are using the guiding principles of long-held U.S. Supreme Court, which is all going to be in the full report that you can review. Tennessee versus Garmer is one of the main cases that we look at. Graham is another one. But I would urge you to look at the full report because it's going to show all the cases that we've considered. But I just wanted to summarize kind of what is the body of law that we follow.
So do you think that would go considered as the appropriate one, considering whether a shooting is justified, or would you suggest that there's separate standards to be changed?
Well, I know obviously there's legislative efforts to change the use of force. I think, what I support is that we do everything we can to improve outcomes. And today, I'm not going to talk about the legislation. I support whatever we can do to improve outcomes. I haven't, spent all the time studying that. But today is not the day for me to talk about legislation. Today is the day for me to talk about this case.
Does this standard keep our community safe, the table of standards that we have?
I'm not sure how to even answer. I know what my job is to follow the facts and the law, and that's the standard. It's been a long process, sir, and we just literally have concluded our review within the last week. It's been a lot. I mean, all of this stuff took a long time. The crime lab, the autopsy, the toxicology, the independent experts report. So it's been a process that's taken a long period of time. Yes. I'm not sure we'd ever be able. We just know there's a flash of light. There's no evidence he was reporting on the cell phone. We know that he had his hand, the phone was out because the phone was taken out, or was found underneath his body. We know the phone was not out when he jumped the fence and then was standing by the car. So the phone came out in the backyard. I'm not sure how we would do that. We just know there was a flash of light. Yes. That's the picture, Sam. It's a flash of light. Sorry, you asked. I'm not here to say that. I don't think that's not my role. Okay. I didn't say that. I said it's not my job to say that. I'm not here to say that, right? I'm saying a jury would be able to consider that evidence to assist them in trying to understand Mr. Clark's behavior. And so they would be entitled to that evidence, yes. Well, they didn't have their cell phones out at the time of the shooting. Mr. Blazina, I don't know if we received that, but we know what we know is from the body-worn camera. That captures everything from the moment they got there to that scene to the ending of that incident.
So like you were looking at text messages, their cell phone, that's not our cell phone.
Well, we judge the state of mind at the moment of that incident that happened. That's what we're looking at. That was what was captured on the body-worn camera. Well, we judged what happened in the 2 days leading up to it because clearly he was heavily impacted by what happened on March 16th. Mr. Blazina? No. I don't believe we were provided any information that they had any toxicology. It may be a protocol. We have no indication that there was anything that impaired these officers. We didn't receive anything on that. Pardon me? That's not my question to answer. I don't answer that. Yes. Oh, the muting? No, because that wasn't done. That was done after the incident was over. Now, that may be a policy question, obviously, that they've addressed, but it didn't impact our review because we're looking at that moment in time. The muting did not occur until later. No. I didn't interview them. We were provided the interviews from the police department and then the Department of Justice as well.
Borrow about 2 rounds and say, so this part of it when that's the person that shot him about 2 times. Show you.
Well, the legal analysis that we have to look at is what we call the use of force. The question of how many shots are fired are a tactical policy question. Our question is, were they lawful in their use of force? That's the question. And I know it may be frustrating because there's a lot of shots fired. He was hit 7 times. And I understand that, but that's a question that you should ask Chief on. I'm sorry, we've got to have one at a time, you guys. He cussed back at the officer. You can listen to that on the body-worn camera. Yeah, you can listen to it, and you may need to use enhancements, but you can. Just that he used the grate to smash the Camry window. About 15 feet. So half the distance between him and the officers at the outset. I don't believe those were, no, there's no indication he had those on at the time. As far as I can tell. The video indicated that he was advancing on the officers. Both officers stated that he was in a shooting position. Right. You can look at the expert's report. You can look at the full report. You can look at all the body-worn camera captures. It's dark. Well, the body-worn camera and what they said at the time and immediately after.
When did they exactly start firing the first shot? Was it when they saw the light and the stance, or was it when they started walking?
So when they rounded that corner, he was in a shooting stance, holding his arms out. You heard the officers then say, "Stop! Show me your hand, gun." You can watch. It's all on the video.
The officer said that he saw a light and gun.
Muzzle flash. Yes, that's when they shot. Yes, and you can see it.
But I'm wondering if you see the light and a stance, then you fire, or was the light flash stance, then you fire? I'm trying to figure
Well,
out.
what the officer said was that he believed it was a muzzle flash, and that he was either being fired upon or about to be fired upon. They don't have to wait to get shot to use deadly force.
From a legal perspective, what does it mean?
It means that that officer can use whatever force is necessary to prevent the threat. If they believe that they are under the honest and reasonable belief that they are in imminent danger of death or great bodily injury, they can use deadly force, just like any other citizen can. There's no indication that that was happening. He was advancing against the officers. If he wanted to keep running, he could have kept going around that corner of the house. There's many questions that a jury might have. Why does he smash windows and not steal anything? Why does he jump fences in his own neighborhood? Why does he smash the rear sliding door of a neighbor while the helicopter's above? Why does he not go into his house? Instead, go along the side of the house and stare into a car? There's a lot of questions that could be answered. And my ultimate point is that all of that cell phone evidence would be relevant and admissible in court. I can't tell ultimately what was going on in his mind. What I know is from that cell phone evidence is he was in a state of despair. He was impaired. And that may affect his judgment. I talked to her this morning. She's very upset. That's what I would say. I don't want to go into the details of it, but she's very upset, obviously. I mean, this is her child. This is her child, and nobody can take away from that. No one finds glory in today at all. It's sad. No human being should be in this position.
What is your fear in the community now to make this publicized or on all the
I'm just like everybody else. I want a healthy, happy community. And I want people, understandably, I understand if they're upset, but I'm hopeful that people can unite together rather than divide.
you ever consider if this had happened in another neighborhood, if white people set up some of the traffic and the same problem would happen?
I don't consider somebody's race when we make decisions. We look at the facts and circumstances. As you see from that helicopter, the sheriff's deputy says, the only thing I can see, he's got a hoodie on. That's about all they knew. Now, I'm not going to make any assumptions just because of a neighborhood. We look at the facts that are presented to us. Nothing changes because of a zip code. On, like, policy stuff? No, I mean, that's not our traditional role. It doesn't mean, though, as the DA, that I don't maybe have an opinion on things. I'm not an expert on use of force.
So in your opinion, should the officers still have
I'm not in that position. It's not my responsibility. I don't get into the IA personnel stuff. Oh, I'm not saying on this particular case. I'm just saying I would like to have policy discussions about how we improve outcomes. But I am in no way in a position to say whether these officers. 2 minutes. Yep.
I think we'll do one more question, then we're going to go.
You mentioned that you have opinions about improving outcomes, and you mentioned at the beginning of the meeting that people would be reasonable to ask if other tactics could have been used. So what are your opinions about improving outcomes and the possibility of using non-lethal tactics?
Well, that's always a possibility. I know the police department has made a number of changes. I have tremendous respect for Chief Hahn. I can't answer that question in this particular case. What I can say is, in this case, the officers believed that they needed to use deadly force. So, with that, we're done. Thank you very much.
Will you do this type of thing again?
Bob, what happened? What did he say? It depends on the case. It depends on the case. Thank you very much. I'll just walk out and I'll get it out there.